Okay, so today we're looking at perception. I like this quote up here. It says, "There are things known and there are things unknown, and in between are the doors of perception." So basically meaning we know a lot of things, and there are quite a few things, obviously, that we don't know, that we have to choose to make perceptions or perceive the world around us based on only those things that we do know. So everything in between is more of a perception rather than an actual reality. Now, sometimes our perceptions are reality and sometimes they're not. That is something I want you to consider as you go through this lecture. Perception. Let's think about that word and how it impacts your expectations for how things will look, how they'll sound, and how they'll feel. So before continuing with this lecture, I want you to go through to the text-based version of this lecture and watch this clip of Britain's Got Talent. It's an audition clip of Edward Reed, who is now, he's got his own music out and albums and all of that, but it is an interesting clip. When I first saw it, I thought, oh, my perception of him was quite different from the beginning to the end. So watch this. Take a minute. It's a little bit funny. So take a minute and watch this 6-minute video and think about how perception may play a role in your expectations for how his audition would end up sounding. Okay, so take a minute right now. Alright, so hopefully you have taken a minute to watch Edward Reed and have made some assumptions based on what you saw. Your perceptions probably changed drastically from the beginning to the end for the better. You may have stereotyped him at the beginning, and we will talk about that later. Let's look at another option to listen to that I find quite interesting. You are not so smart. Now, don't be offended. This is just the title of a very cool podcast. I know I've mentioned before that there are tools podcasts that have great information, but I just love this podcast. If you have any desire to hear experts in psychology or experts in science and how we do things that are not so smart, that we make assumptions, that we choose actions that are actually quite stupid on occasion, and why it is we do those things and how we can maybe get past them, this podcast is fantastic. Now, I have put a link to this specific episode of this podcast, but if you listen to podcasts or if you're willing to have a go at listening to podcasts, which if you don't already know, podcasts are very easy to receive on your phone. You use iTunes, or you can use an app like Stitcher or Dogcatcher or what have you, and click on whatever podcast you're interested in. And those things can be your traditional news podcasts, all the way to podcasts on things like this, or on science, or on decorating your home, or conflict management. All of those things you could find in podcast format. And you just listen to them as you're driving. So one of the things I would recommend you check out is this episode. And it's basically about perception and how it can lead to unconscious or long-held opinions and prejudices. So I want you to take this podcast, take a minute, listen to it. It is long, so do it when you have a moment, or connect to your device and allow that to get you to listen to the podcast. You can use that on iTunes again, or Stitcher, or Dogcatcher, or whatever you use. But take a minute to either subscribe to this podcast or listen to this episode and hear what neuroscientist Laura Meister has discovered in her unconventional experiments and what results she expects in the future. So take a minute and listen to that when you get a chance. Let's move on to perception as a whole. In perception, we have a basic definition. It is a process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting information from our senses. So what does perception do? Perception helps us to interpret that chaos of all of our senses, what we see, what we hear, what we touch, etc. So perception helps us to get through all of that. Perception is a big, huge, massive part of communication. So consider what your values are. what beliefs you hold, religious, political, lifestyle, all of your various opinions and how you came to them. Where did they come from? How were they developed? Most likely, much of what you believe or value is based on these perceptions that you hold. We're not 100% sure where they came from in some cases, and in other cases we're confident we developed these perceptions based on our upbringing or our experiences or something similar. But most of what we believe is based on these preconceived notions or these perceptions. We see things and then we respond to them by creating meaning. We create meaning from all of these little bits of notes. It's like seeing a bunch of post-it notes with all of these little stats and facts and figures, and you take all those post-it notes together and you come to a conclusion. You may be completely off, totally wrong, but you're using your senses. You're using this data that you're gathering with those senses to come to conclusions. Like I said, could be correct, could be incorrect, but you're using that to formulate perceptions, ideas. I want you to think of perception as a necessary and useful tool on occasion. Without active perception, we really would be lost in the chaos of everything that we see, hear, and feel. It'd be overwhelming. So we take the senses that we experience and we formulate ideas and interpretations about how that information molds itself and works together. When you have a moment, again, I know we've already asked you to do this twice before, but when you get a chance, check out this trailer for the movie Inception. Maybe you've even seen it. But I like the trailer because it really highlights the idea of the word inception and of that movie. It's a great movie. If you get a chance to watch it, it's fantastic. So check out this trailer and look at how even our dreams and our perceptions can alter our reality. Okay, let's take a minute and do that. Now, the basic process of perception has three very simple steps. 1, selecting, followed by 2, organizing, and then 3, interpreting. So here are some starting explanations of this process. Now, here, these are the basic definitions. And we've done this before, so you can see kind of basically how the process of perception works. First, you start with selection. This involves focusing attention on those sights, those sounds, tastes, touches, all of the things in our environment. So it's all those sticky notes. It's all the data coming in. Then, once we have all that data, we organize it. And that's the second step of perceiving. And that's where we use all of our senses and we structure the information that you've selected. So the information that you're actually obtaining, because there'll be too much for you to even recognize. But we use that information that we decide to focus on in a coherent pattern in our mind. And then once we have organized it, once we've grabbed the things we're going to focus on and we've organized them, then we interpret them. And that's the final step in perception. It's the act of assigning meaning to the information we have selected. So let's look at the steps in a bit more detail here. So again, we start with selection, which involves focusing our attention on all those senses. So there are two things that come with selection that we need to examine a bit further. Both of these things affect what information we choose to, quote, select, if any at all. So you're going to get a boatload of information and you will choose to select or pay attention to only a small portion of that information. So the first thing that might be a major factor in whether you pay attention to that information or not is salience. Salience is the degree to which particular people or aspects of their communication attract our attention. So when is a communication instance salient? When is it prevalent to us? When do we select it based on its salience? 1, when a person behaves in a visually and audibly stimulating manner. So maybe the person is loud or is wearing crazy clothes or is just something outside the norm. That would be salient. It would be a visually or audibly stimulating manner. The next option would be maybe if our goals and expectations lead us to view the communication exchange as important. So maybe you feel like, okay, this lecture today in my class is going to be on the test. So I am going to select this information. I'm going to focus on this information because I know it's going to be important. I find it as salient, as vital, as important. And then also, when the exchange deviates from our expectations. So, for example, one of my biggest ones is going to a movie. And I have expectations when I go to a movie that people will be quiet and watch the movie. When that is deviated from, or people go outside my expectations and they're very loud, obnoxious, getting up and getting down, crawling over laps, that kind of stuff, that deviates from my expectations and I focus on it. I pay very close attention to those things. They're very salient for me because they're outside of my expectations. So that's one way we choose to select. We might find things that are salient to us and we select that information to organize and interpret. Another thing we may choose to do is to have selective perception. So we pay attention to things that are familiar or things that we are familiar with or what is very important to us. So in a big, large crowd, we might single out the people or the group that tends to be a little bit familiar to us, whether they look like us, are acting like us, or are even people that we already know. We're going to select that group. Or if we are in a library or in a store, for example, and we are looking at a large selection of clothing or a large selection of items, we might focus on what we need at that moment, what we are looking for during that trip. So it's selective perception. We may miss good deals or we may miss an interaction because we're not focusing on everything. We're only focusing on what is important or what is familiar to us. Now, here's a good example. If you've watched the Harry Potter movies, which I'm a big fan of, I even have a dog named Neville, after Neville Longbottom. And he's a dachshund, a wiener dog, so I thought that was funny, Neville Longbottom. Just thought I'd throw that in there. Anyway, if you've watched those Harry Potter movies or read the books, I want you to check out this next clip because you'll be able to analyze it effectively. Again, go to the text-based version of this assignment or this lecture and watch the clip. It's only about 3-4 minutes long. In this clip, Professor Moody, who is the temporary Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, attempts to teach the students of Hogwarts about the 3 unforgivable curses. And you'll notice that certain students seem to focus on certain curses, and there's a reason. So take a minute, pause this, and go watch that clip. Okay, so now you're back, and hopefully you've watched this about 4-minute clip. Which student focuses on which thing? If you look down here, we have organized each of the 3 curses and provided the person that is focusing on each of those curses and why they focus on them. So for example, Harry Potter is obviously going to pay very close attention to the Avada Kedavra curse because his parents were killed by the curse and it was also used on him. So all of these, and the same process applies to both the Imperius and the Cruciatus, I'm sorry. So these students are really zooming in or focusing in on each of these individual curses because they have personal application to them. And that's a very common thing, selective perception, as we mentioned up here. We pay attention to what we are familiar with or what has value to us or is important to us. So we select those things and focus on them. Now, each person has personal experience with each of those curses, so they have selected which curse to focus their attention on. And once they do that, they can organize their thoughts. They're focusing on the information. Now they're coming to organize that information in a way that will allow them to interpret it. So organization is the second step of perceiving. That is consisting of structuring the information that you have in a coherent pattern in your mind. So you're saying, okay, what happened first? What did I see first? What did I accept first as far as data goes? And then which comments or behaviors caused subsequent actions to occur? So what things happened first and what followed those things and why? So right here in this picture you see an image, and I want you to determine what you see here. Which came first to you? Was it the black side of the image or was it the white side of the image? Did you see a vase first or did you see two faces first? I personally saw two faces first, but maybe you saw the vase. Now, if you're looking closely, you can see obviously a vase outlined right here if you are seeing the white first. If you are seeing the black first, you're seeing a person's face here and a person's face here. So it depends on where your perception was and how you organized it. What came first? What subsequent action followed? You first saw the vase and then you saw the faces, or vice versa. So you organize that information in a specific order. Now, once you've done that, then you can interpret what you're seeing. So if I noticed, okay, I'm seeing black first, black is the forefront, then I have organized that black is first, and I am interpreting it that, okie dokie, this is a image of two faces, okay, which might be different for everybody. Now, once you get to that section, that interpretation, that is when you assign meaning to the information that you've selected. So what do we or can we use to interpret what we are seeing and what we hear or what we touch and how we've organized it? So there are a couple of things that we can use. One is schemata, which is basically the expectations we hold about people or places or events that we're involved with. So we interpret things because we have previous or primary expectations about those people or that place and so on. Another way we can interpret information that we've gathered, selected, and organized is by using attributions. So basically creating explanations for others' comments or behaviors. And those kind of come in two forms. First would be your internal attributions. A person's behavior can be explained by things that are internal to themselves. So you project interpretation of information on a person based on their character or their personality. And more external would be a person's behavior is explained by outside factors. So if I go through a drive-through and the person that is taking my order is really rude or is having a bad attitude with me, I could attribute that behavior to internal attributions by saying that person is just a jerk, that they have a bad personality, they're mean, they're naturally just not nice people. They're just bad all around. Or I could interpret it to an external factor, an external attribute, and I would say that obviously this person's having a bad day, maybe they got injured in some way and so are cranky at the moment, or the customer right before me was really rude to them, whatever it might be. It's outside their control. It's an external factor, an external attribute. So it depends on that person or that instance why we choose to attribute behaviors in those ways. And why is this important? Obviously, in many of these cases, it's subconscious. We don't even realize it. But that's the key. We need to realize it. When we start to interpret data, when we start to have these perceptions, it's important to know whether those perceptions were interpreted based on internal data or external data, internal attributions or external attributions. Because I can believe something permanent about a person because I used internal attributions that could be completely incorrect. And I lose a relationship or form a stereotype about a person or a group of people when all that information that I used is absolutely incorrect, that it could be completely explained by external attributions, or vice versa. Now, some of these errors can be pretty significant. Let's look at what errors there exist in attributions and some examples that you might be able to use to understand it. The first error would be something called fundamental attribution error. And this is where we tend to attribute other behaviors to the kind of person they are, when instead it may be a social or environmental factor, which is exactly what I just gave an example of. Another example of this fundamental attribution error might be that your boss just totally told you off, and if we employ that fundamental attribution error, then we believe that our boss is just a jerk or has a bad attitude, instead of thinking about what might have set him or her off. Maybe it was us. Maybe what we did deserved that telling off. Or maybe it was somebody else, and the boss is just reacting to what someone else has done or what event had just occurred, and we need to step back and allow a cool down time so we can move forward effectively. That's a very common attribution error. It happens when we subconsciously use attributions and interpret data without really thinking about it. Another one is actor-observer effect. This is where we tend to attribute external factors to explain our personal behaviors. So we're looking at ourselves in a different way than we would look at others. So you get your math exam back and you note that you received a 56% or an F. You immediately blame the teacher's ability to teach or the way the exam was written without considering whether it could be because you didn't study for the exam, or you're not getting it and you're not asking for the aid that is needed. So you blame others, or you attribute where you are to external things rather than internal things. The next one down here in our final error, our final attribution error, is self-serving bias. And these have similarities to the previous ones. Self-serving bias is when we take credit for our successes based on internal factors. Like we're very charming, or our personality is persuasive, or we're just wonderful people, instead of external factors like luck, or someone being generous, or just some good timing. So for example, you were picked for a student worker position on campus. You attribute that success of getting the position to your amazing resume and your charming good looks, or your wonderful persuasive skills in the interview, when reality might be that you were the only one that applied, or you were the best of the worst. You never know. And not to say that these things happen all the time, but they do happen on occasion, and we have to be aware of those. Why do we have to be aware of those? Because of one of the most major problematic attribution errors that exist, and that is stereotyping. While the process of perception is very simple and very straightforward, it can often lead to very ineffective and inaccurate interpretations of information that we gather. So this can lead to those stereotypes and other very large generalizations that we may use to cause problems in our relationships without even noticing it. Basically, on the whole, stereotyping is a way we form impressions by perceptually categorizing people in a social group and then evaluating them based on information we have in our mental schemata related to that group. So remember, the schemata is all that data, all that information that we formed. And we take a person or an event or an idea and we categorize it. We say, all right, because you adhere to these looks, or because you are this age, or because this place is located in this area, I am going to categorize it as a certain person or a certain group or a certain place. And then we developed our impressions or our interpretations about that group based on that categorization. Okay, so stereotyping is a very hard thing to avoid, very difficult. Why, you ask? Well, with all of the information that we have available to select from, actually now more than ever because of all of the advances in technology, it is only natural for us to automatically categorize pieces of information in order to make sure and make complete sense of the chaos, and in turn make our lives kind of a little bit easier. It's not possible for us to go through and fully understand and fully dive into every single piece of data we receive. It's not. Does that mean that stereotyping is okay? Of course not. When it comes to interpersonal relationships, those one-on-one relationships, or just a generalization of people, it's never okay to fully stereotype. We are way, way too complicated to be categorized. It's just not possible to do it effectively. But is it ever okay to stereotype? Not is stereotyping always okay, but is it ever okay to stereotype at all? In general, no. However, there are certain situations in which you may actually benefit from stereotyping. For example, if you were walking down a dark alleyway at midnight in New York City by yourself, and you see a person in a doorway with a ski mask, or maybe just a hood over their head, in that case, it might be okay to stereotype that person as a, quote, bad guy and run the other direction. It's actually happened to me, by the way. I wasn't by myself, but I was like 18 with two other 18-year-old girls and stupidly walked down a alleyway in New York in the middle of the night. And there was a, quote, bad guy, or I perceived him to be a bad guy, and sped up the pace a little bit. Now, he did begin following us, and we took off, and ended up being okay. But had I not stereotyped him as a bad guy and not picked up the pace, maybe I would have been in a really bad situation. So yeah, it's okay in some circumstances. Now, we can also stereotype events, not just people. We can stereotype events. For example, you may receive tickets to the Super Bowl, which you've never been to before, and you automatically stereotype the experience you will have as awesome. In this case, it might be okay to pump yourself up and be excited with a very positive attitude, even though you've never actually experienced the Super Bowl. You've never actually been there. You are making assumptions and you're attributing things and beliefs to that experience. And in this case, it may be totally fine to do that because it gets you pumped up and you're excited. But what about the times when stereotyping is not the right choice? Then what do we do when we catch ourselves doing it? How do we overcome those negative effects of stereotyping? First, let's critically assess your beliefs about various groups. Now, you can literally sit down and write out your beliefs. You could do that, and there's ways to do that. We actually might take that route here later in the semester. Now, you can do that, and I think it's a great tool. But what is more logical, much more likely, is for you to sit and start thinking as they occur. So when you start feeling that you're stereotyping, or when you're meeting a new group of people, or when you react to something and you do it kind of subconsciously, you don't even realize you're doing it, maybe walking a little bit faster or locking your doors in certain places, or assuming people know things that they may not know, critically assess what your beliefs are. What do you think about that group, about that person, or what category you put them into? Once you know what those beliefs are, then you can educate yourself about those groups. How are they similar to myself? How are they different? Look up stuff. Ask questions. Spend time with those groups. I know this is not something that you can do in every circumstance, but it is a great start for any situation. If you have very strong religious beliefs, assess what those beliefs are, and then educate yourself on those that have other religious beliefs. Same with politics. If you feel very strongly to one direction or another, assess what those beliefs are. What do you feel? And how do you feel about the other side? And then educate yourself about that other side. Never, ever, ever form opinions on someone or something without direct information. Try to be as educated as possible. When you form opinions on someone or something without that data, without that experience, without that information, you will formulate incorrect data, incorrect information, incorrect beliefs. You'll stereotype. So use that education. Be thought-provoking, be intelligent about it, really work to make sure you are educated in these categories that you hold strong beliefs in. And honestly, if you want to bring it down to the nitty-gritty, at the very minimum, if you are able to educate yourself on all sides of a viewpoint, whether that be religious or political or just interpersonal, if you're able to educate yourself on all sides of a viewpoint, you'll be able to argue your side better. So make sure you know what all sides of the coin are and what exists on all sides so that you can most effectively argue your point or maybe change perceptions. Finally, keep mindful that just because someone belongs to a group that is not yours, it does not mean that all of the defining characteristics of that group apply to him or her. Just because someone is an 18-year-old female does not mean that all 18-year-old females are the same. All right? Just because someone is a Muslim does not mean that all Muslims are the same. Just because someone is a liberal does not mean that all Democrats or liberals are the same, and so on. Keep that in mind. Once these stereotypes, prejudices, and bias are developed, it can affect our awareness and potentially your self-concept, like we talked about last time. So consider how these biases and stereotyping can affect your self-awareness. Are you even aware of those biases? Are you aware if those are stereotypes? Consider these questions when you find yourself judging a person or a situation or a belief or a lifestyle in any way. All right, folks, have a great week, and please email me with any questions you have on perception.